Hello! Today we're going to learn how to complete a religious property tax exemption declaration. If your property has been granted an exemption from property taxes due to religious purposes, you'll receive a form such as this every year, and it is necessary to complete this form and return it to the courthouse in order to continue receiving the exemption. For our example, we'll use this property here. Now, as we complete the declaration for this property, we'll need to take into account each building individually as well as all the open space on this property. Now, this property is split up on 3 separate parcels, and each parcel has its own declaration. So as we complete each of these declarations, we're going to need to answer the questions specific to what is happening on each specific parcel. We cannot complete all 3 declarations exactly the same and taking the entire property into account as a whole. So to begin with, let's start with the parcel that contains the church. Now, if your property is split up on 3 separate parcels, such as this church is, you're going to need to figure out which parcel or which declaration describes which part of your property. Now, each of these declarations are labeled with the account number, also known as a parcel number. They're also labeled with the site address. This can be confusing for people, especially when they have multiple buildings on a parcel that have each been granted a mailing address by the post office. We can only put 1 address per parcel, regardless of how many mailing addresses there are on that parcel. And each declaration also has the legal description for your use as well. So moving on down the form, we'll take a look at the questions. The first question asks whether or not this property is a place of worship, and it is. And then we're going to answer how many times this church meets for worship, how many members this church has, and how often they meet for reasons outside of worship. Basically, what we're getting at is how often is this property used for religious purposes, and how many people benefit from the use. So there's about 200 people on average. They've either registered as members for this church, or if no registration process is required at this church, then we're just going to estimate about how many people show up for worship every week. So about 200 people for this church, and they meet about 3 times a week on average. The next questions are for properties that are religious in nature but not necessarily a place of worship. So we can either leave these questions blank, or we can just write NA here. And then moving down to the next question, we're going to fill in everything that happens here that is not necessarily worship. And we're going to answer all of our questions directly on this form. There's no reason to include a separate piece of paper when there's plenty of lines, plenty of room here to answer your questions. The next question talks about income, and it is asking where the income of this church comes from. It is not asking what the church does with their income. It is just simply asking, of all the income the church receives, how much of it comes from the church members? And for this church, that answer is 100%. This church does not have any rental income. This church does not have a thrift store or any other income except for what they receive from their church members. So then we're just going to complete how much this property is valued at. If you don't have an idea, you can contact your insurance agent to find out how much this property is insured for, and this is just for reporting purposes. The next question asks about rent. Now, we're not asking about when you allow somebody to use your fellowship hall for a banquet on just a single time basis, so we're not asking about allowing a church member to use your hall for a wedding reception. We're asking about when an individual or an organization or a business uses your property on a regular, continual basis, and when money changes hands because of that use. You could call that rent, you could call that a charitable donation, you could call that just reimbursing the church for utilities or cleaning or whatever the case may be. But anytime somebody uses the church building on a regular basis and money changes hands due to that use, this is what needs to be written in this portion of the form here. So for this church, that answer is no. So moving on down to the form, the bottom part of the form is pretty simple. We're just going to write in our name here, our title, and the best phone number to get a hold of us. Now this may not necessarily be the church phone number, it may be your personal phone number, it may be a cell phone number. If the church has a website, a lot of times our questions can be answered just by visiting your website. And of course, email is just a lot more convenient. Now before you complete this form, you may want to take a look at the questions and think about them seriously, because you are signing this form under the penalty of perjury. So keeping that in mind, we'll go ahead and sign our name here and date it, and there we go. The form is ready to go and send back to the courthouse. Now if for whatever reason you have additional documentation you feel like we need to see to make the exemption decision, I'm just going to ask you to please do not staple anything to this form. Once these forms are received, they are scanned and all of those staples have to be removed. So if you need to include additional paperwork for whatever reason, just label each one with the parcel number that it applies to. So let's move on to the parking lot and see how we're going to answer these questions for a parking lot parcel. So the first answer is obviously going to be no, this property is not a place of worship as it stands alone. But the next question asks if it is affiliated with a place of worship, and it is. So then now we need to figure out how to communicate which place of worship this property supports. So we'll go back to the form that we just filled out and locate the parcel number, here again just above the church name, or you could also use the site address. However, I recommend that you use the parcel number, but you just fill that in on this line right here. And then we complete the next question explaining the use of this property. Now the next question has already been answered on the church declaration, so we don't need to answer it again here. But we do need to put how much the parking lot is valued and whether or not it is being rented out. So let's move to the last parcel. And here again we have multiple buildings and each one needs to be used for religious purposes to qualify for the exemption. It can't just be sitting there and not being used for anything, and it can't be used for the benefit of a person individually, even if they are a church member or a church employee. So the first part of these questions are going to be answered just as the same as the parking lot. None of these buildings are a place of worship on their own, but they do support a place of worship, and we have identified which place of worship they support. So we'll just answer this next question, and we're going to write down everything that each building is used for. We're not going to leave any buildings out, and we're going to answer all these questions directly on this form. There we go. Now here again, the next question's already been answered, so we don't need to do that again, but we do need to put in how much these buildings are worth and whether or not they're being rented out. So let's recap. First off, we're going to ensure that we only refer to the buildings and the land on the parcel, and we are going to make sure that we address all the buildings and all the land for the parcel we're completing the form. If there's a large amount of open space, say enough to build a home on, maybe almost a quarter acre, something of that nature, that open space needs to be addressed as well. Because remember, it cannot sit empty and not be used for anything and qualify for a religious property tax exemption. That piece of land needs to be used at the bare minimum for recreation for the youth group. We're going to understand that we're signing this form under penalty of perjury, so we're not going to lie and we're not going to use staples. Alright, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to visit our website at canyonco.org/assessor, or you can always send us an email at the Assessor Department at canyonco.org. Thank you.